Welcome to Crypto in America Live, the only show bringing you candid conversations on the biggest news stories, legal issues, and policy developments shaping the crypto world. Every Friday at 12:30 Eastern. Happy Friday, y'all.
Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. Good morning.
Good morning. It's been a busy week, I think. Not a crazy news week, but busy week.
Yeah, sometimes when I'm writing the headlines, I'm plucking things from like thin air, right? I'm like looking for things like, where should we go with the headlines today? There's really not much. And then other days it's like, oh my God, there's so much to choose from. I feel like today was sort of an in-between day. It's like there was a lot, but also it was a little, not repetitive, but I feel like some of the stuff was a little kind of like mundane. You know what I mean? So
I think we're like just inching forward on so many things. Yeah.
Like a lot of the rulemaking stuff, not that it's boring.
We've seen this show before though. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly.
Samey, right? It's very samey. That's the thing. So like, yeah. But we're going to be seeing a lot more of that going forward, obviously with Genius, and then we've got Clarity. Once that passes, that'll be a whole nother couple of years of rulemaking implementation. So we got a lot more to get talking about on the show when it comes to rulemaking implementation. But we do have a great show for you all today. Brett Redfearn, he is the former SEC Director of Trading and Markets. He just joined Securitize this week as the president, and he's going to come on to talk about that, what he's excited about for the future of Securitize. They've announced that they're going to go public soon, so Brett's going to come on to give us the details there. We have Patrick Witt. He's the Executive Director of the White House Crypto Council. He's going to give us an update on where things stand with the Clarity Act. And Amanda Tuminelli, she is the Executive Director of the DeFi Education Fund. She's going to come on to talk about Roman Storm's acquittal hearing that happened in a Manhattan District Court yesterday, and the details there and what we can expect for a possible retrial later this year. But a lot to get into, so let's get started with sort of the mundane headlines. But I don't think the first story is very mundane. It's the report from the White House Council of Economic Advisors, which, as most of our audience knows, was released Wednesday morning. And the crux of it was that it finds prohibiting yield on stablecoins would only have a minimal impact on preventing deposit flight from banks and making a hit on lending for them, suggesting that those concerns that the banks have been talking about, basically the crux of this whole argument between the crypto industry and the banking industry, those concerns that banks have been talking about for these last couple of weeks to months may be overstated, according to this report. But Gerald, we've talked about this before the report came out. We were kind of like, well, how are they going to measure? Because, there's no real concrete data yet, because stablecoins really are just sort of a new tech, right? We kind of have to wait and see how, once they're mainstreamed. And you're like, I don't know, it's math, right? We're just going to have to see what the report says. So it's based on economic models on the current market conditions. But what's your overall take from the report we saw on Wednesday?
Yeah, and so I've got some stats here. In a past life, I did economic impact studies for a couple different things. Like it's math. It's like I think you can challenge a lot of the assumptions, but to me, the headline is like, there is absolutely no way that the impact is anywhere near what the banks are claiming. This idea of like trillions in lending, I think so. Just a couple stats. 2.1 billion, or 0.02% of total loans, 1.7% of deposit equivalent holdings are currently in stablecoins, $300 billion market cap. And community banks would only account for 24% of additional lending, while large banks would take 76%. So this has been the entire issue with like banks really leaning on community bank deposits and saying, oh, there's going to be so much flight and all of our members. And as we talked before on the show, like these large banks are going to be prepared to deal with this. Like they're launching their own stables. So to me, the headline is just like, even if you're doing the math on projections, the numbers are tiny. And so, we've compared this to like money market funds and the same arguments that, were made around introducing that as a new asset class. But I think what this hopefully does, and I don't know that it will actually impact policy, because I think like the banks tried to sort of clap back pretty quickly, but is like your size is not size. Like your fears are like not as big as you thought they were. And so that to me was a big takeaway, but we'll see.
I think also the stablecoin market cap is like $300 billion, like you mentioned, but so much of it just sits idly like a lot of people don't even stake it or get yield in any capacity. So that's like a whole other conversation, is like, how do you get people to even like press a button? And you do that like one click yield type of conversation. I know that's not necessarily what this is getting at, but it is overstated in some capacities. So it's an interesting study.
Yeah, I did just want to get your take quickly on the flip side of the argument. I guess more of the pro banking side is that, and I didn't put this tweet in to be pulled up, but I will just read it. It's from Todd Phillips. He's banking administrative law at Robinson College. He says the issue has always been distribution of reserves between GSIBs and community banks. And the report explicitly says that the Council of Economic Advisors made unrealistic assumptions about deposit flows to community banks. So is the issue still that community banks are going to be affected the most here?
I mean, my issue then help the community banks. Like what? I don't understand. Like these guys have been a dying breed for a long time. Like market share post financial crisis for large financial institutions has been skewing the wrong direction the entire time. So if your concern is that this is just an additional hardship for community banks, then figure out how community banks can benefit from stablecoins. I know we've talked to Cody at the chamber about that before. You know, there are plans to kind of update some of this technology where they don't have the resources to hire a whole stablecoin or digital asset team. But like that's an entirely different argument. Like you don't point out that community banks will still be worse off when like there's clearly no plan to save the community banks coming from like the big 8 financial institutions. So I don't know. It just seems like kind of a red herring, which is what people have been saying about community banks kind of this entire time. But yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Okay, we can get into this with Patrick in a little bit as well, but let's move on to Treasury's FinCEN. It's proposing sweeping changes to its anti-money laundering programs, and it's renewing its focus on combating illicit finance. And at first, when I saw this headline, I was like, okay, this is kind of like another rulemaking-ish type announcement, the kind that we see all the time these days. But you dig a little deeper, and it's actually pretty interesting what they're proposing here. Namely that banks would not be dinged in the future unless there is a systemic failure to maintain their BSA and AML programs, because before it's been really difficult, I think, for banks to be able to like comply. There's been a lot of like compliance issues around BSA and AML for how much paperwork I think goes into it, and a lot of just like outdated systems. I believe Treasury Secretary Besson referred to this in the press release that went out around this. And then another thing is that bank regulators would not be able to take enforcement actions against a bank without the explicit approval of FinCEN. So my immediate reaction is like, okay, banks are a little bit off the hook here, maybe a little bit less on the hook for some of these violations, unless they're like massive in magnitude. And then you've also got FinCEN kind of centralizing itself as sort of maybe like the, the kingmaker here.
Yeah, I think you can also take this with like the dual mandate. It's not a mandate, but of the OCC in approving a lot more bank charters. I think what this gets at is the cost of compliance for a lot of banks has just become prohibitive. And again, I just mentioned like we've seen very few new banks post financial crisis just because we made a lot of these compliance obligations so burdensome. So and then you didn't talk about it. Hopefully we'll talk about it, but like just in the wake of everything going on, I don't think we're going to talk about Anthropic's new Mythos model this show, but like the other thing in there was access to the cyber risk like framework, which is obviously a really big deal for our industry and for like the world going forward. So it seems like, yeah, loosening the leash a little bit, but also still maintaining authority to, step in and catch bad actors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had a tweet from Cody to put up on that front, just signaling how this framework or new move, right, is really bringing the crypto industry further into some of these systems that in the past have only applied to the traditional banking system. So positive for the industry, I think, in the long term, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Well, speaking of Treasury, Scott Bessent weighed in on passing the Clarity Act in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal this week, and it set off kind of a ripple effect with lots of other officials weighing in, echoing his sentiment on X. You know, off the top of my head, I can think of Paul Atkins, Mike Seelig, a couple of the House members, Brian Stile. A lot of these people weighed in, kind of saying, "Yep, he's right. Let's do it. Let's pass the Clarity Act. It's time." But I have to say, I think the most, David Sachs too, but I have to say the most important call out, I think, was Brian Armstrong. And he tweeted last night at 9 p.m. There's the tweet, basically saying, "Yep, we agree. And we're grateful for all the bipartisan work." So to me, that says Coinbase is good with the state of the bill, maybe, and they're endorsing it now to be passed. So that's my take.
I love
literally, that is what Brian's saying right there. It's time to pass the Clarity Act. So yeah.
I've loved trying to kind of like read the tea leaves with all the Paul Graywall tweets as well. Like it's a process. It's good to see the unity around, you know, let's get this done. I think that we've talked before on the show about so many different things that have to happen even once we're done with the stablecoin yield issue. But yeah, good to see. You know, and obviously, again, like we talk a lot about how, like, you know, we know we're not the only thing happening in the world. So the fact that like Treasury is still putting an emphasis on this is also like really, you know, really positive to see.
Yeah. What are we going to talk about once, if and when Clarity passes? I guess when.
Regs.
I'll be optimistic here. Yeah.
We're never going to run out of Clarity content. We got, like,
I mean, honestly, even with Genius, it's been like a year or so, and we still talk about it all the time. And like the effects of it is still coming through. And I think, yeah, honestly, that'll be the same with the Clarity here. Do we want to read some of this, Sally?
So yeah, sorry. This was Besant's op-ed in the Journal. The parts I highlighted, I just thought were notable. Obviously, Genius can't be realized without Clarity's support, and then economic security is national security. I thought that was pretty notable. Just Treasury Secretary weighing in hard on passing digital asset regulation. I wonder how much of an effect this is going to have on the Senate Banking Committee scheduling a markup. I think probably the be all end all of all the tweets from the officials after this was kind of to put pressure on Chair Scott and the Senate Banking Committee to schedule that markup. They come back from recess next week, so it'll be interesting to see if we hear maybe some kind of direction or whisper about a calendar date. But right now, I guess, yeah, I think they're still targeting the end of April is sort of the understanding, but we'll have to see.
Yeah, I think if we could pull that back up again for a second too, it wasn't the part that you highlighted, but on the front of what Scott Besant was saying was essentially it's like, whether that ecosystem will develop domestically or abroad depends on the durability of U.S. rules. And then at the end of the next paragraph, it says something, something, something about often vulnerable offshore markets. So he's essentially saying like it's inevitable whether or not it goes through the U.S. But, you know, if we put the rules in place here, it could be the home of it. And like, this is a conversation we've had in the past with like Bo Hines and like just founders in general. Like so many of them have left and now are coming back because the rules of the road are being written here. But, you know, if we can't get this together, then, you know, it's going to happen elsewhere. And then what happens, you know, with the US innovation and everything.
What happens to crypto in America?
Yeah.
It becomes crypto global, crypto and offshore markets. That's a new show name.
Yeah, but I just want to, on that point, like the US often determines so much of global financial regulation, and then there's a lot of fast follow that happens. And I feel like what happened in our industry was, in the absence of regulation and all this regulation by enforcement, a bunch of other jurisdictions, whether it was like UAE or, you know, Singapore, like other, you know, other offshore jurisdictions, you know, Europe obviously passed MiCA, which, you know, we don't talk about a ton on this show, but it was not maybe, it was a very European bill. But like when you look at the influence of the US, like Canada is now talking about stablecoin legislation. And that probably only would have happened if Genius had passed in the US and there was some kind of demand from constituents like, hey, we want to use these assets. This is where things are going. There's a lot of cross-border commerce that needs to happen. So it is like a fair point to say, generally on financial regulation, the US sets the rules of the road, and then other jurisdictions feel like how to conform with those rules. So yeah, it's good to see, and hopefully we will actually get it done. Hopefully we're not just tweeting about it.
Yeah, no crypto and offshore market shows sometime soon.
Yeah.
Although I think that's a good name.
One other thing that was notable this week was the launch of Morgan Stanley's Bitcoin ETF on NYSE Arca. It drew in 34 million in volume on its first day and around $30 million in inflows. And Amy Oldenburg, who is the head of digital assets at Morgan Stanley, they recently hired her. She said it was the best first day of trading for any of the Morgan Stanley ETFs.
Yeah, no, it's impressive. And in a bear, right? Like I think, Ellie, in the show notes, you had some comments about like the other inflows for different ETFs that had launched maybe like over the summer or in the fall when, we were still riding pretty high. And so to see those kinds of inflows on day one in this kind of a market was like obviously, pretty impressive. And then having Morgan Stanley, I saw some tweet, it was like, Morgan Stanley Bitcoin ETF, like what a crazy headline to read in 2026. But here we are.
Yeah. And I did think too, I was thinking like, wow, like really BSOL, which was Bitwise's Solana ETF, and then XRPC, which is Canary's XRP ETF. They both had day one trading volume of like high 50s, high 50 millions. But to your point, Gerald, I think the market might have been a little better at that point, but also those were like new asset classes, right? Bitcoin ETFs have been around now since January 2024. IBIT has most of the market share. So what I think analysts believe is going to happen here is that Morgan Stanley might take some of those clients away from IBIT. It's never going to beat IBIT in terms of being like the biggest market, biggest ETF in the market, but may steal a little market share just with like advisors and wealth clients and that kind of thing. So super interesting. But yeah, I mean, Morgan Stanley, no joke.
Yeah, I think I also would just point out like on that front, and I know we talked to Hunter Bitwise about like the diversity of their sort of business model in a previous episode, but you do also have to remember like Morgan Stanley is one of the largest wealth managers in the world, right? Like if not the largest, they're up there. And so to see these inflows, like you have to think about like where this demand for ETFs is coming from, right? Like a lot of these either high net worths or like other institutional or like individual clients that they may have. Like there's obviously demand here for these types of products, which I think again, like 5 years ago, if you were talking to a retiree about like whether or not they should have exposure to Bitcoin, it was probably not a conversation they were having with their Morgan Stanley wealth advisor. So
yeah. I mean, listen, we talk a lot on the show about the mainstreaming of digital assets and the bigger role TradFi is playing in that integration. And if you kind of want to look at where the space is headed, we could talk about Morgan Stanley, and we could also talk about people who are moving into it. So we would love to bring on our next guest from the tokenization firm Securitize, which just announced it's tapped the SEC's former head of trading and markets, Brett Redfearn. He's the president now as the company prepares to go public. And we're excited to have Brett on today. Brett, welcome and congrats.
Hi, thank you very much. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. I mean, prior to joining Securitize, you served as the director for the SEC's Division of Trading and Markets, like I mentioned. You also worked for JP Morgan and Coinbase. I think maybe given your background knowledge in capital markets and the regulatory landscape, what do you think is the biggest opportunity today that's ahead for us?
Well, again, thank you for having me. And I love this last discussion because it's really interesting to see the way that traditional financial market participants are really starting to embrace this space. And having been involved in these discussions for several years, while at the SEC, certainly while at Coinbase, and then in the last several years running my own financial advisory practice, you go out and talk to firms, and there was a period of time when it just felt like, the bulge bracket banks, a lot of traditional finance, they were very skeptical. There was a lot of hesitancy about diving in. There was interest in having like innovation areas, explore things, but they weren't really diving in. And then, a couple of years passed, and then you got to a place where they were, wow, we're really interested. We need to learn more. We need to get smarter about it. And it feels to me like, in the last year, certainly since the change in administration, increasingly it's like, okay, we got to get moving. We're behind. We want to catch up. We want to do something. We want to, make projects happen. And so that tone has changed a lot. So I think that traditional financial market services firms generally are gung ho to, you know, stop talking, stop thinking, and start doing, and really start to make some projects happen.
Yeah, Brett, you mentioned the change that the industry has gone through, and you've been a long time participant and sort of, you know, watcher of the space as well from your time at the SEC. If you remember, I'm sure you do, during that time in 2018 with the Hinman speech, regulators were really trying to give some kind of semblance to the market, to, you know, to investors, to really try and figure out what digital assets were. But what do you think now, looking back, regulators were really missing back then that we have today? And is it something along the lines of maybe the promise of the technology is now a little bit clearer? We have leaders like Paul Atkins in place at the SEC who understand it, or is it better education? What would you say is sort of like the overall, or is it many things?
I'm sorry. So is the question, what are they missing? Or
Well, yeah, I'd say just looking back, you know, what were regulators back in 2018 when the Hinman speech came out, and it was very different than it was today. What were regulators missing then that they are not today, that we have today?
I was thinking you might go back to that, because I remember that was one of the last conversations we had. Yeah. I will remind you that when all of the stuff came out in the FOIAs, I was the one who was like, just say it. Just say it. Like, let's get out there. Let's try to provide some clarity to the market. Listen, it was a different time. And, you know, so if you want to kind of go all the way back then, when I first joined the SEC, you know, it was after 14 years at JP Morgan, very much of a traditional financial services background. Honestly, I was surprised, like literally in my first week, I think it was on Munchie. I remember I ended up in a room and people were like, we're having this big conversation of, okay, we have to decide, is this a security or is this not a security? And it was, you know, ICOs were really taking off. So, you know, so you have to realize the context. The context in part wasn't necessarily just crypto products. It was actual securities where money were being raised. So the ICO thing was a little bit different than some of them crypto. And there's some things there that were in fact violative of the securities laws. And ICOs were kind of a thing. The other thing was, you know, it's interesting when you join the government, you know, all of a sudden you're getting these briefings, and these are briefings from, you know, like, you know, I'd secret clearances, right? And you'd come in and you'd find out things that were happening in, you know, terrorist financing and in money laundering and in, you know, other areas where there was a lot of concern from parts of the government about what was happening in the crypto space. You have to remember that if you go back to that period of time, you know, remember, we've been through a lot since then. We've seen a lot of things happen. We saw a lot of bad stuff happen with the crypto winter, and there was fraud, there was manipulation, there was a lot of things. So unfortunately, a lot of the negatives were much, you know, more salient and top of mind than a lot of the opportunities. And so I think that was a factor. And I think that there was a lack of clarity, even in the SEC. There was a lack of clarity about what was our jurisdictional authority over some of these other products that weren't securities, right? And so it was sort of like, are they securities? Are they not securities? So it was a very different time. And, you know, suffice it to say that when I think about the transition that happened in my own career, one of the reasons why I reached out to Coinbase was because I did feel like, you know, while we did different things, we got statements out, we tried to, you know, create the ability for, you know, a three-step process to allow ATSs to trade digital asset securities, right? So there were baby steps that were made. But for the most part, it wasn't, you know, it wasn't as successful as I would have liked it to have been. So that's one of the reasons why I talked to Coinbase. I'm like, okay, you guys want to tokenize coin? You want to think about what we can do with securities? Let's do this. Like that, I have unfinished business. So they had purchased 2 broker dealers, and I was like ready to dive in. And you know, unfortunately, again, we were in the Gary Gensler era, which you know, whatever the shortcomings were during the Clayton period, they only got a lot worse during the Gensler era. I don't think there's going to be much argument about that. So it was a difficult time. You know, it wasn't the focus in 2021, right? Shifted to DeFi and NFTs and things like that. So I left Coinbase, but it was there. It was there during that process that I met Carlos Domingo and I met the Securitize team. We were looking at vendors, and I actually really liked these guys. I thought, you know, these are people who are really trying to figure this out in a way that won't get them into as much hot water with the SEC as some of the other participants, some of the other players in the market. And so when I left Coinbase, like, Carlos and I got to talking, and I've actually been advising them since late 2021. So it's been a long road with them to get to this point today.
So what made you decide from advising to, okay, I will join and I will take a W-2 and I'll be a full-time employee at Securitize now?
Yeah, it was in fact a hard decision. I have a lot of really interesting clients and I'm doing fun work. And for a while it's kind of an interesting thing where you have many bosses, but you don't have any. So there was a lot of autonomy and pretty good cash flow going on there. But the reality is, my whole career has been about markets. It's been about like looking at market evolution, looking at how, technology changes and then regulatory, regulations change. And then, the ways in which people trade and interact and market efficiencies change through, floor-based markets to electronic markets with Reg NMS. And so when I look at the changes that are happening now with blockchain technology and tokenization, it's like the most interesting, cool market evolution you could possibly imagine. Like 10 years ago, I would have no idea that we would have an opportunity to create a whole new financial market infrastructure, to create new products for investors, to create greater autonomy and self-control for individual investors to do things with their own securities, to allow issuers to have new ways of communicating with their clients and new ways of, of creating efficiencies in how, and how they're managing their own securities. So the opportunity is just too interesting, and Securitize is so well positioned that there was a certain point where it's like, dude, you got it in you to like kind of get in this space, because I honestly believe that, like I have a TradFi background, but I've been deep into what's happening with tokenization and crypto enough that I almost feel like an obligation to be involved in this, because, we need people who understand these two sides of the world and help to pull it together and make sure that we make this whole thing work.
So Brett, on the note of pulling it together, so you're leading a tokenization company going public via SPAC now. I guess first question is, are the shares going to be tokenized? And the second is, when you think about the future of publicly traded companies, how do you see that changing with tokenized securities? Like, where do you see that going?
Okay, so the answer to the first question is simple. It's yes. Yes, there's a very clear plan to do that. And with Securitize, one of the most interesting aspects is the amount of time that we're looking at tokenizing public stocks and how does that work? And you're really talking about building a whole new ecosystem, and so it's developing incrementally. And I think there still is a lot of skepticism to a certain extent about what that's going to look like. But what people don't realize is how much building is going on behind the scenes, how much building is going on, to figure out the custody side of it, to figure out the market side of it, to figure out, the ATSs and DeFi platforms that can handle securities, and then to figure out, what is the utility for issuers and what is the value proposition that's going to make more and more public companies and funds see the value in going down this road. My gut is that, as it unfolds, we're going to see, firstly, existing companies with shares tokenize portions of their shares, right? So it's a lot harder to sort of do a full-fledged IPO on a new company, as opposed to saying, okay, this is really cool, let's try this out. We can get certain of our customers are going to want to have tokenized shares. Let's take X% of our float, tokenize it, and then let's start to realize what is the value proposition with that. So I think that is something that we're already seeing. You'll see Securitize recently announced they're doing something with currency. They're doing something with FG Nexus. They were the first ones that tokenized Exodus shares. That was several years. I think that was 21. So you're seeing that happening already. Another question is whether or not we need a dual share class, right? So should it actually be the same share class? And then when it's the same share class, you have to sort of figure out how does it affect price formation in the existing market, whether there's fungibility across different market centers. There's a number of questions that come up with that. Reg NMS is one of them. But the dual share class is interesting because in that particular case, you can have a different set of shares that are understood to be able to price differently that might not be NMS securities. Therefore, they may be able to trade on other platforms. And so there's a lot of benefits of going that route. But at the same time, when you go that route, then the issuer actually has to essentially do another registration statement, and they have to sort of launch, whether it's a preferred share or something else, they have to launch something separate. But I think you're seeing that already happening. That's one of the models that's going. And I think those two things will be very real. And I think the sort of the IPO market and new issuance market is coming. But I think that is, has a few more layers of challenge to it.
Yeah, real quick on that, there's been a lot of, I guess, debate about in tokenized stocks not really being true, like redemption rights to the underlying, right? Not to get on the weeds on this, but and then there are true sort of tokenized equities coming straight from the issuer versus something kind of wrapped in an SPV. Do you think that we have kind of the tech stack now to support more, I don't want to say direct issuance, I don't want to mix terms here, but more sort of direct redemption rights, like true tokenized equities, or do you think we're still going to see a lot of these like wrapped models, to your point about like different share classes and that kind of thing?
Right. So it's a great question. And it's a really important topic, because when people talk about tokenized securities, oftentimes they're talking about totally different things. Right. And so the SEC is putting out some guidance, which has talked about the different typology of tokenized securities. Probably might bore people to get into the nuances of it, but suffice it to say that the first one is issuer-sponsored native tokenization, right? And that is the one that Securitize is focused on. The second one, then there are two types of third-party sponsored tokenization. Those are essentially what people refer to as wrappers. One of them is a custodial model where they custody the underlying securities. And the other one is more of a synthetic model where they're more like derivatives that are trading in the market. And so when you talk about this, it's kind of interesting. People say, oh, it's a tokenized security. Totally different conversations depending on what you're talking about. So in the wrapper model, there's a couple dynamics that are worth noting. One is that they often do not pass through the full security entitlements. And at Securitize, I'm going to say we now, right? So I should be wearing my Securitize hat here. But at Securitize, we actually really believe that's the best model, that you should have securities that are passing fully on all of the entitlements. You should get dividends. You should have the right to vote. You should have all of the benefits of owning that security, while at the same time, you should be able to custody it. You should be able to post it somewhere as collateral. You should be able to figure out your own stock loan, benefits that come from that, the whole 9 yards. So that's the model that we're building. On the wrapper side, you might not get the full security entitlements. And secondly, so keep in mind a lot of what you're seeing happening in Europe with these models. Not only is there also is permissionless transfers, right? And so one of the key issues that I think people have to pay close attention to, and I think regulators globally have to figure out, is the fact that a lot of the transfers that are happening offshore in some of these securities are happening permissionlessly. There's a lot of folks in the crypto community that's great. We should be fully permissionless. We should allow this to happen. I understand what the arguments are for that. But at the same time, keep in mind that we have FinCEN, we have OFAC, we have surveillance obligations, we have audit trail obligations, you have transfer agent obligations, right? So there's a lot of things in the existing securities rules and laws that make not knowing who that owner is, not knowing who the buyer is, and then is it going to Al-Qaeda and Hamas and Russian oligarchs and whoever else in the process before it comes back? So there's a lot of issues that are being uncovered there that really need to be worked out as we think about what that wrapper model is going to be, and whether or not that's ultimately good for U.S. capital markets. Because at the end of the day, and keep in mind, this may be my years at J.P. Morgan and my time at the SEC, but we have the best capital markets in the world. If you look at where capital is going, we are efficient, we are trusted, we have all the things. And this might sound kind of like cliche, but it's great, and we want to keep it that way, right? And so we really have to balance these things a little bit carefully as we go down that road.
I love the energy.
I know.
I'm yeah, we do. Yeah.
I drink a lot of coffee.
There we go.
I think Carlos picked a winner as his president here.
Yeah, there we go.
I'm excited. I'm really excited. I think the opportunity is great, and I think Securitize is really well positioned. Keep in mind, Securitize Like, what I liked about them is they got a registered broker dealer, they have a transfer agent, they have an ATS with the SEC, they have all of the licenses and the regulatory pieces in place. Honestly, they don't need clarity. They don't need much from the SEC. Like, we're ready to go.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, Brett, thank you so much for coming on today. Congrats on the new role. And I'm sure we'll be hearing more from you and the team soon.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
So much energy. I love it. Oh, wow. Well, let's get to our next guest, because we are very, very lucky to have the executive director of the White House Crypto Council, Patrick Witt. He has been deeply involved in negotiations around stablecoin yield, part of the Clarity Act, which we will get all into with him in just a few seconds. But basically the crux of the news, and we talked about this a little bit before, is that the White House Council of Economic Advisors dropped a report this week suggesting that if crypto companies offer stablecoin yield, the risk to banks would be limited, which seems to support that many in the crypto industry that they've been saying the last couple months, right, that this does not affect banks and crypto should be fine and free to offer stablecoin yield. So what does this mean for the ongoing policy debate? Let's bring in Patrick Witt. Patrick, welcome back to
friend of the show.
Friend of the show.
Hey, Patrick, how are you feeling? Do people ask you that often? How are you feeling?
Get asked that very often. I appreciate it. Feeling good, cautiously optimistic, as we have tried to maintain throughout this entire process. We've been hard at work over the past few months since the markup came down in January to get it back on track. I do think we have made some considerable breakthroughs, obviously rewards and yield, but some of the other issues that were cited as reasons for people withdrawing support back in January, confident that we're also have made a lot of progress on those. So yeah, looking forward to getting things back on track and hopefully marking up very soon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, Patrick, let's start here. Banks have been notably quiet since this report was released on Wednesday morning. What, if anything, have you heard from them privately, and would it have any effect on the status of negotiations at all?
So the CEA report was actually something that we asked them to look into back in January when the markup came down. So they took considerable amount of time, did a lot of research looking into the issues, and really did a proper treatment, which is what we were hoping that they would do, so that there was just another group of PhDs, very smart people who understand economics at a much more profound level than I certainly do, and that I think the senators are comfortable dealing in, to look at the issue and see what their thought was. And so it came back. We had an opportunity to preview and brief a lot of the senators on the findings in the report weeks ago, and that helped the discussions around the compromise on rewards and yield get to the place that they ultimately ended up. So not necessarily new information to the senators that are involved in working on that compromise, but good to have it out there publicly so that people can engage with it, and that there is just another independent view as to the issue at hand. People are obviously concerned on either side of it and advocating for their position, and I think this was just another helpful data point, objective view of the issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mentioned that banks haven't said anything publicly on the record yet, but some banks have been speaking on background and off the record. And the tone there that some of us reporters are getting is that the concern hasn't been so much about total deposit flight, which is kind of leaning away from the narrative that we've been hearing, right? Number one, but it's kind of more, where does the money end up and how big banks are going to win out over these smaller community banks, right? I guess in terms of the policy compromise agreement, what is your reaction to that they're saying this now after the White House report comes out?
Well, I would challenge some of the people saying we never said this was about deposit flight. That was absolutely one of the issues that was discussed. And, we've always been cognizant of the fact that big banks are different than community banks. And so in looking at this in the report, you'll notice that CEA looked at the stickiness of deposits at larger institutions versus smaller institutions, and found throughout the research, and this is not, just necessarily in the context of rewards and yield, but the banking sector over decades, the evidence shows that community banks those depositors, those customers tend to have longer lasting relationships. The deposits tend to be stickier. It's more relationship based. They're part of the community. It's in the name. And so, it is probably of the different sectors, the one that is least susceptible to yield chasers, if you will. So that was definitely something that they evaluated in there. I think as we've talked with community banks throughout this, we believe that stablecoins and different crypto products and just digital finance in general offers them an opportunity to build out their suite of products that they offer to their customers, allows them to move money in a different way, in a cheaper way. So we view it as a part of the product suite that they can actually enhance their offering to customers. And some of the smaller community banks that are a bit more innovation friendly, I think, realize that and are embracing these technologies. They're getting smart on them. They're figuring out ways to partner with different digital asset infrastructure providers, stablecoin issuers, to offer this as a product to their customers. So I do believe it's an opportunity for them. We're managing through an interim period. I've said that from the beginning. I think right now it's threatening and scary. I think in a few years it's going to become part of the product suite, and there's going to be a lot of banks that are early adopters of this technology are going to find that it actually enhances the value that they offer to their customers.
So, Patrick, on the other side of the coin, the industry also seems to have been doing a pretty good job about not talking to the press and sort of trusting the process here. Just on that note, now we've seen kind of a flurry of activity in the second half this week. Do you think we are close to like a compromise that moves us forward on clarity?
I do believe we are. I won't speak for the senators, but working with Senator Tillis, Senator Alsobrooks, their teams, the rest of the banking members that have expressed this as a priority for them, I'm very confident that the compromise language that has been discussed is kind of the true center of gravity on this issue. And that's not to say that crypto's thrilled about it or the banks are thrilled about it. But as Senator Alsobrooks said a few weeks ago, this is one of those issues where we'll know we got it right when both sides are kind of equally unhappy and through gritted teeth say, we don't love this. It wouldn't be our ideal outcome, but we can live with it. And I think we probably arrived at that place. But the senators are ultimately going to continue to do their final solicitation of input from industry stakeholders and decide if ultimately they'll stand by that compromise. But I'm very confident that they will.
Yeah. So then what can we expect from when Congress returns next week? If yield is wrapped up and there's still a few outstanding issues, can those kind of realistically get ironed out in the next couple of weeks?
I think so. Rewards and yield was that issue that everyone knew had to be solved before the other issues could be addressed. Otherwise, you're kind of wasting effort on the other ones because we knew that rewards and yield, without that getting wrapped up, we were never going to make it to the other issues. So I think there's maybe on the part of certain Senate offices a realization, oh wow, this rewards and yield issue that we didn't necessarily think would get resolved. Perhaps it looks like it is, and we better quickly engage on these other issues. So there is definitely a resuscitation of the other outstanding issues right now, and a lot of engagement, energy going back into those because people realize we need to quickly close those out if we're going to move this bill forward.
Mm-hmm. And Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent weighed in. As you know, Patrick, you retweeted him, and then a lot of other folks in the industry retweeted him as well, including Paul Atkins, Mike Seelig, David Sachs. And with that said, I feel like that maybe is putting a little bit of pressure on the Senate Banking Committee, on Chairman Tim Scott to schedule a markup. I think the consensus right now is that there may be rumblings about a possible markup at the end of April. I know you obviously don't speak for Chairman Scott, but with sort of the pressure campaign we saw around with Senate Scott Bessent's op-ed, are you feeling good about a late April markup in the Senate Banking Committee?
Yeah, I'm in regular touch with Chairman Scott about this, and we're staying abreast of the different issues, letting him know where those stand. whether that's ethics or the BRCA, Section 505, you name it, some of those other issues that still need to be wrapped up. So he is up to speed on where things stand right now. And I know that once he feels confident that we've got all those issues in a good place and that his members are in a good place, I'm confident that he'll schedule the markup with haste. So we'll stay in touch. We've got more work to do on our end, working with Senate Banking Committee, the different offices to get it in a good place. But I know that the chairman is eager to get a markup on the books himself.
Yeah. With that said, I sat down with Chairman French Hill, the House Financial Services Chairman, on Monday, and he was very complimentary of your efforts personally to keep the House in the loop while all this craziness has been going on in the Senate. So from your vantage point, are both chambers right now kind of aligned on the text as it stands? Are they talking to each other?
They are talking to each other. We convened a meeting between House Ag, House Financial Services with Senate Ag and Senate Banking just this, I guess, earlier this week. I'm losing track of days for exactly that reason. We don't want to get in a situation where we get a product out of the Senate and then there's a number of issues that the House has been raising that weren't addressed in the Senate, and then we fall down on the 2-yard line. That would be a travesty. So we're making sure that their input is being heard and incorporated to the greatest extent that it can now, so that that product, when it goes back to the House, is something that they recognize, that they're comfortable with, and that they're ready to pass. Because we do recognize that they're an independent chamber. They've got their own view. They sent over a very good product to the Senate last year, and we got to make sure that we're incorporating all of their concerns and their issues so that we don't run into those later and wish that we had addressed them now.
Mm-hmm. Patrick, aside from everything that we asked you about, what else are you paying attention to that you think our audience should be watching right now?
Oh, it's a great question. I don't know, maybe I'll throw out, and I can't say that I've spoken with the chairman of Ways and Means in the House, but there is discussion of reconciliation potentially sometime in the fall. So we will look to see if there's an opportunity to potentially address some of the tax bills that have been talked about in the Senate and the House during that time. Again, there's going to be a lot of different considerations, not just crypto, but if there is a reconciliation process, we would hope that there might be an opportunity to add some of those provisions in there. So that's just something to keep in mind. I know that some of the industry stakeholders that's their top priority are very keenly aware of that, but maybe for some of the others that market structure has been the only topic they've heard discussed, there might be an opportunity for some further crypto legislation if that comes to pass.
I think they'll be very happy to hear that, Patrick. Thank you for coming on today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All
I hope you get a break this weekend.
Me too. Me too.
It's supposed to be nice. Weather's good. Yeah. Thanks, Patrick.
See you soon. Well, to round out the hour, let's bring back Amanda Tuminelli, a frequent guest on Crypto in America Live. She was in a Manhattan courtroom yesterday for the motion for acquittal hearing in the Storm case. It's a case we talk about on the show quite a lot, where he's facing a guilty count for operating an unlicensed money transmitter business. The judge is yet to issue a decision, but Amanda says there was already discussion around retrial dates, signaling that this case might have a long way to go. Amanda, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming back on. So we saw your tweet, and the tone was not an optimistic one. So why don't you tell us sort of the tone of the courtroom? We can get into specifics, but what was the tone of being in that courtroom with the judge, with the prosecutors, with Roman himself? I believe he was there, and the defense team.
Yeah, everybody was there in person. And, it wasn't that big courtroom that we were in for trial. It was Judge Fela's typical courtroom, more of an intimate setting. And I will say that she went out of her way at the beginning of the hearing to say that she had not made up her mind. She, I think more than I've seen other judges do, made it clear, like she said, I would not be having this hearing if I didn't have questions for both sides. And she came in with a long list of questions. They were detailed. I don't really feel like you can read into the questions for one side versus the other. because she really asked tough questions on both. But it was a long hearing. We were there. I left at the 2-hour mark, and I think it went for another half hour to 45 minutes after that. So it was intense. It was detailed, right? We're talking about the technology, but also whether venue is appropriate in Manhattan and whether Roman's motion on various grounds should be thought of in a certain way, what test should apply. So lots of legalese, lots of discussion of the tech mixed in, and really hard to tell where it's going next. But, you know, there was a long discussion of trial dates, and I guess I would have felt more hopeful that it would be dismissed if there wasn't such a focus on scheduling the trial for the end of the year.
Mm-hmm. I guess what would you say is the more strategic choice in order to make a stronger case now then?
So I think on the Rule 29 motion itself, which is a motion for an acquittal, right? It's Storm asking the court to set aside the jury verdict and say, in fact, there weren't facts to support the jury verdict. I think there's not really anything left to do on that motion, because now it's just up for Judge Fela to write a written opinion and tell us whether she's going to grant or deny the motion. For the trial, meaning the retrial on the 2 counts that the jury hung on, I think there's some advocacy work to be done behind the scenes and trying to see if DOJ can move off of their position and some of the problematic theories that they talked about.
Yeah, on that note, Amanda, so the DeFi Education Fund filed an amicus brief arguing that holding developers criminally liable for third-party misuse of their technology is flawed because, obviously, as the industry knows, a lot of these smart contracts are autonomously deployed, can't be upgraded by a single sort of individual. If the government wins here, and we've talked about this on the show pretty frequently, what do you think is like the chilling effect for developers in the US?
I mean, I think it tells developers in the US that if you make an immutable tool, if you make any tool that's neutral, but you don't have control over it, you can still be held responsible for what other people do with that tool. And that's a limitless proposition. That doesn't just affect crypto. That's any software tool that you put into the world and no longer have control over. So that is concerning. I know that software developers are concerned about it, right? It's an interesting experience to talk to somebody who's building code, but like can talk to you intelligently about criminal code section 1960, right? That's not normal. We don't really see that in other areas.
Yeah, Amanda, something that stood out to me in your tweet was that you said basically leaving the hearing, the only thing that was clear to you was that the government still did not understand the tech at issue. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, how long has this case been going on? Like more than a year at this point, through a whole trial and now potentially another one. At this point, would you say it's more of a choice in order to make maybe a stronger case for the opposition, for the prosecution, as opposed to like really not understanding the tech? I mean, what would you say is a disconnect here? Is it willful ignorance, or is it like actually like, okay, no, we don't get it?
I mean, it's really hard to say. Like, I don't want to ascribe negative motivations to people without knowing them, right? But like you said, this is a well-developed factual record. We have hundreds, I think thousands of pages of motion practice where the tech is explained in plain English, right? In addition to the evidence itself. They've now heard testimony from witnesses and experts and expert reports. So to still not understand the difference between what a user interface does and what an immutable protocol is really concerning, right? Like that is, I don't know how you explain that. And there is such an amount of skepticism towards privacy technology in general that like it is hard not to just believe it's a bias, right? Like everyone in the courtroom, the judge, the government, the defense, all agreed that the creation of privacy preserving protocol itself is not a crime. So from that base level principle, you would think then that maintaining that code or simply updating the original code or providing a user interface that doesn't change that code would be looped into that. But the government is making that distinction. And I think there was a quote yesterday that was like, what it does is like innocent funds help cover up criminal funds through this protocol. Like there is such a skepticism toward any type of privacy preserving technology that is pervasive in all of the conversations that were happening yesterday.
Mm-hmm. Amanda, the jury convicted Roman Storm of conspiracy to operate an unlicensed money transmitting business, but deadlocked on the money laundering and sanction charges. And that can carry up to 40 years, essentially. And the DOJ is pushing for that October 2026 retrial. So what does that kind of tell you that prosecutors want another bite at this, so to speak, at the more serious counts?
Yeah, I mean, they clearly want a second shot. They made many mistakes in the first trial, right? Like putting aside all the evidence and the legal arguments, like they just made mistakes. They called a witness whose funds did not actually go through Tornado Cash. Their experts were confused and did not end up testifying about the topics they were supposed to testify about. So my sense is like they just want a second chance at doing the trial with better strategy, right? And I think what's problematic about that is like, they often say like the Biden DOJ started this prosecution, but now it's the Trump DOJ continuing it. And it's hard to imagine how we're supposed to be like the crypto capital of the world when this prosecution continues.
Yeah. Yeah, Amanda, I got to get your read on where things stand with the Clarity Act. I mean, we just had Patrick Witt on. You might have heard him say that yield is wrapping up and there's a couple more issues to tackle. You've obviously been watching the DeFi side of everything. How are you feeling about the BRCA? Are we coming to some kind of agreement, conclusion there? What's your read?
Today at 11:58 a.m., I am feeling hopeful. Ask me again in a couple hours. No, I'm feeling hopeful about it. I think it's going in the right direction. I haven't seen updated text, and that is always the best way to tell how you feel about a bill is to see what's written down on paper. So until I actually see it, I can't tell you what like it does for DeFi definitively, but the direction we've been going in has been positive. We've been having very productive conversations on DeFi and specifically Title III, the illicit finance provisions related to DeFi. So I will be eagerly looking forward to seeing what Title III looks like in the next go round.
Same here.
All right.
And I got to get your one take really quick, Amanda, on this Politico story. Cops versus crypto clash looms in the Senate. Is there really a rift between crypto and law enforcement groups around the DeFi side of the Clarity Bill at this point?
There shouldn't be. At no point has anybody suggested that we want to take away tools from law enforcement. I think it is interesting that state DAs and state sheriffs have so much to say about a federal law. Of course, they have investigatory capacity when there are overlaps between state and federal law, but Section 1960 is a federal law, and the BRCA doesn't even change Section 1960. It just says how money transmitting should be defined. So all these opinions from people who don't actually have prosecutorial authority over Section 1960 is interesting to me. I think they're repeating talking points from others. And I would say overall, there are many prosecutory tools available in the bill itself. Like if you pass market structure, you'll actually get more prosecutorial tools. And there's many other ways to go after people who are laundering money or evading sanctions.
It keeps going.
It's not boring.
No, never,
Sure.
never.
Yeah.
Amanda, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, good to see you.
All right, guys.
We got to make it to the courthouse one of these days and go sit in on that too.
Yeah, go hang out. It's much more boring than you think it is.
I covered the FTX trial. I remember those long days, but maybe these ones are a little different.
As someone who was at a lot of days of the Roman trial in August, it's tedious, but the days that are interesting are interesting. I'll say that.
Very well said, Eleanor.
Yeah, right. Very eloquent.
Just openings and closings. That's it.
There we go. Awesome. All right. Well, happy Friday. And thank you to everyone for listening in, and great show, guys.
Yep. See you guys next week.
Have a good weekend.
Yeah.